Hi, everyone. Welcome back to those who joined us at the beginning of the film screening, and welcome to those who are just logging on now for our panel discussion portion. As our panelists get reconnected, I am going to share a different screen here, so bear with me for 1 second. All right, and again, thank you to everyone who is joining us today. My name is Athena Bertolino. I'm the program manager of the Future Rivers program at the University of Washington. Future Rivers is a graduate training program. We are housed within Earth Lab in the College of the Environment, and I am happy that we are able to present this spring speaker series with you all. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to honor place. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I personally am working from home today, and I am on the lands of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Stillaguamish, and Coast Salish, where I'm currently located. So I hope everyone found, who was able to watch, found that episode thought-provoking. There was definitely some pretty eye-opening statistics that were provided. I do want to say a couple logistical items. One is we will be recording this portion, and the recordings will be posted on our website for anyone who wants to watch the panel presentation or might have to pop off early. We'll also be, this is a 3-part series, and we'll be posting the presentations from the recordings from the other 2 parts as well on our website. And I will share that with everybody in the next couple of days, along with any additional resources that might come up during our talk, so you all have that. One other logistical item, please use the Q&A rather than the chat feature to put in any questions that you have. You can start popping in questions now that might have come up during the film screening. As any questions come up during the panel presentation, again, go ahead and put those in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. And we truly do want this to be interactive and useful to the audience, so we highly encourage any questions that you might have. And then with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to our moderator, Chelsea Wood. So I'm going to first acknowledge Amir Sheikh. Unfortunately, Amir had a family emergency happen overnight last night and is unable to join us today. But we really appreciate his willingness to participate in the conversation. He is a self-described transdisciplinary urban environmental researcher, curator, and collaboration builder. He is the curatorial associate at the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture at the University of Washington, where he co-leads the Water Lines Project. And until recently, he was also an affiliate faculty member of the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. And again, we thank Amir and keep his family in our hearts and hope everything is well with him. And I know he has spoken with and worked closely with Rich Watts, one of our other panel presenters, who will do his best to channel some of Amir's thoughts. And we also have with us today Ken Workman. He is a descendant of Chief Seattle, which is colloquially known as Chief Seattle, and is a retired systems and data analyst from Boeing's Flight Operations Engineering Department. He's a former Duwamish Tribal Council member, as well as a former Duwamish Tribal Services president, and is well known for his community advocacy efforts in the Puget Sound region, where his family has lived for time immemorial. So we welcome Ken to the conversation. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Rich Watts. He is the director of the Center for Canadian Studies within the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. He's also an associate professor of French and served as chair of the UW Department of French and Italian Studies. He currently teaches a fascinating sounding class called The Water Crisis in Literature and Film, which examines how the pollution, privatization, and manufactured scarcity of water are rapidly altering its previously stable symbolic value in literature, cinema, and other forms of cultural production. And in just an example of a way that water connects us all and threads through everything, I just coincidentally, right before this call, came off of another call that was the launch of a virtual water gallery by an organization called Global Water Futures. And I'll share that resource with folks too, but it is a really interesting cohabitation space for science and art that was just launched today, where artists, water experts, and knowledge keepers and the public are able to co-explore water challenges via visual art based on water and how we connect to it. So again, I'll share that resource, but it was just interesting that that happened to come up today. And so let's see, I think I've gone through, touched on all of our logistics. So I am going to turn it over to Chelsea Wood at this point. Dr. Wood is an assistant professor at the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences within UW's College of the Environment. She is head of Wood Lab, which focuses on the ecology of parasites and their hosts in the marine and freshwater ecosystems. And her work was recently featured in National Geographic and on the podcast Science Rules with Bill Nye, the Science Guy. She is also a Future Rivers Executive Committee member, so I've had the pleasure of working with her over the past year. So Chelsea, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Athena, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited to get to talk to our panelists. And I'm going to kick it off with one of my own questions, and then we'll go over to the Q&A. I wanted to start by kind of bringing everything that we've seen in the Civilizations episode home to Seattle. And I want to ask you both, how has water shaped the civilizations that have occupied the lands that we today call Seattle?
I yield the floor to Ken.
Oh, well, thank you, Richard. Yeah, right. Duwamish people, we've been living here for a while on these 7 hills. We've got the old stories, you know, about when it was cold and then it wasn't cold anymore. It's called the North Wind Weir story, and there's another name for it. But it talks about the days when it was always cold, and then there was a great war, and then it wasn't cold anymore. So that's my Reader's Digest short version of what really happened. And you can go down to about, I think it's 112th and East Marginal Way and head west over towards the Duwamish River. You'll run into Cecil Moses Park, where this war happened. And in the ground, emerging twice a day from the river, the Duwamish River, are these massive rocks. It's bedrock. And so it explains, you know, when you're trying to explain to your children 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago, you know, 5,000 years ago, you know, how did these rocks show up here? Well, it's this story. It's a story about when it was cold and then it wasn't. And so the rivers came. And we as Duwamish people, we're river people. We don't build our houses high up on a hill because it takes too much energy to walk up that hill to live. And then you have to carry your canoe. And these canoes, a dugout canoe, will weigh 600 pounds. And so you try hefting a dugout canoe over your shoulder and you soon learn. You stick around the rivers, you stick around the lakes, you stick around the places on Puget Sound. And on Puget Sound is where all of the food is. That's where the clam beds are. That's where the oysters are. That's where all the mussels are. The rivers are where the fish are. And the fish are a food source, it's a protein source. So right out here in Seattle, the people that make up the Duwamish tribe are the Duwabs, and Du means inside, and Obs means people. So we're the people of the inside. We're the Hitachstolak Obs, the Black River people, and these are the people from Renton. Big village down there in Renton where the Cedar River and the Black River came together and merged with the Duwamish River. So massive salmon runs were going up through Lake Washington, which is known as Hachu. And so the people of Lake Washington are Hachuabs. And so we as the people we've been living and dying on these hills for a long, long time. And so we're glad to say Guid. This native word, it means welcome. Guid is the welcome, my friends, onto this ancient land of the Duwamish.
Yeah, I mean, that is the story that needs to be told. That's the story that needs to be heard. I'll just add a couple of words. In this course that I teach, we talk about all kinds of global water hotspots, water crisis spots. But of course, we talk about Seattle. This is where, you know, up until at least last March, this is where students were in place. And at the beginning of the quarter, I showed a documentary called Blue Gold. And one of the most profound things that's said in Blue Gold, it comes near the end of the film. There's a water scholar activist who says, you know, if you don't know anything else about your water, nor know your watershed, and know your sewer system. So we talk quite a bit in the class about how we get to know our watershed. What are the ways in which our watershed gets represented to us through, you know, the maps that are provided by utilities, by stories, narratives that have emerged around these watersheds. Doing that with your sewer system is less obvious, but one of the things that we do in this course, or we used to before COVID times, is take field trips to sewage treatment plants to see, in fact, how the story of modern water gets told. It's very different from the story that Ken just told us of essentially, you know, lives, a civilization developing around water because of water. This new story is about the sort of technological interventions that make survival possible. And I think that what we need to do, and what the documentary at times successfully manages to do, is to connect that sort of deep cultural history with what's happening today. And that's effectively the aim of the course that I teach. But, you know, certainly you can say without these great water riches that Seattle wouldn't be the city it is. And this is true of nearly every major city in the world, right? It's almost all of them are built around a reliable water source, because that is, as the film puts it, the sort of the bloodstream of civilizations.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear how our local experiences dovetail with the kind of global perspective that was presented in the documentary. Okay, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. There is clearly a long history of environmental modification in areas where freshwater is available. Does this long history of development color how we understand a quote unquote natural system should function? Can historical ecology help untangle what ecosystems look like before widespread human intervention?
Can you repeat that last part of the question? Can ecology do
Yeah.
what?
Can historical ecology help untangle what ecosystems looked like before there was widespread human intervention?
Sure, but it'll take about 3 minutes to explain. It's an old story. The story was told by my great-great-great-great-grandfather, this person the world knows as Chief Seattle. He was, and I've told this story many times, so if you've heard it, just stop me. But he was talking about during the 1855 of signing this treaty and signing away all of this land, along with many other chiefs and sub-chiefs. He was talking to this governor sent from Washington, D.C. over here to make these treaties. And he says to this governor, the very first thing we require, this is native people. Remember, we never made it to the Bronze Age. So we don't know what metal is. We no metalworking, none of that stuff. So we're already 6,000 years older than everybody else. He says, we require unencumbered access to our burial grounds. And so if I understand the question, it's what was the question exactly?
The question is, how can historical ecology help untangle what ecosystems looked like before widespread human intervention? How can we figure out what a pristine ecosystem is supposed to look like?
So here it comes. unencumbered access to our burial grounds. Because for thousands of years, we've been burying our people in these 7 hills of Seattle. There's 7 major village sites along Lake Washington in Renton on the Duwamish River. And each one of those has burial grounds. And in all of that time, when we take our people to the trees or to the forest and bury them, all that material that was grandma and grandpa goes down into the ground. And it gets redigested in the ground, and through this symbiotic relationship between fungi in the ground and the roots of these trees, that all that material that was the Duwamish people, that was grandma and grandpa and aunties and uncles and warriors, everybody that has died, it migrates up through this relationship of fungi and roots into the trees themselves. And so this is all proven out through Dr. Susan Simard out of British Columbia University. Radioactive isotopes tracking this stuff. And so if you think about the trees and the grass and even the berries that we eat as having at a molecular level your descendants of your people, then you begin to look at the world in a different way. You look at forests in a different way. You look at the very fruits you eat in a different way. And so when we say, thank you, Lord, for your children. For grandma and grandpa. That we see you, grandma and grandpa, in the food that we're eating today. And so now you're connected with the environment. And we know that through modern science, when you look at all the stuff that my great-great-great-great-grandfather was talking about, through the lens of modern science, you realize everything he was saying way back then was true. And so the world changes, your perspective changes. And so how can you change the world? Realize that you better take care of the ground a little bit better, because grandma and grandpa are in the ground. They're in the houses. So when we build our houses and you hear us say our houses have souls, it's because grandma and grandpa are in the uprights. They're in the roofs that protect us. They're in the canoes that we paddle out on the ocean with. So they're everywhere. And this is just who we are as people.
Yeah.
Long answer to a short question.
But I think in a way, the comments that Ken and I are going to be making today are going to reflect each other, because it seems we're both very much interested in narrative, in cultural stories. And yes, so I mean, the premise of the question, can historical ecology tell us what the environment was like at a previous point when maybe it was more hospitable to life? For sure. But I think that it will do so more effectively if it's in dialogue with oral history, right? So I when the question came up, what immediately came to mind is this Haitian novel that I teach, published in the 1940s, but that is itself the bearer of long histories transmitted orally about the environment. And it's the story of a drought that devastates a community, but within that community, there's an understanding of evapotranspiration, right? I mean, it's a folk understanding of it, but it's articulated by these characters in the novel. And the documentary, I mean, one of the things I hope we can talk about is what exactly the documentary means by civilization. I think the term is used in a way that we might want to unpack and problematize a little bit. But in a culture that's aware of how its ancestors lived and transmits that story across generations, there's also an understanding of how the environment used to work and how they interacted with it. And in this novel, it's very clear that what causes the environment to change is deforestation. And that deforestation is not simply a function of people forgetting that the trees are crucial to the water cycle, but rather that they're these external actors who come and use this resource to produce profit. And that's I think another point in the documentary that I hope we talk about at some point, which is what is it ultimately telling us about politics and economies, and how these factors also lead to, generate or accentuate or exacerbate water crises and other environmental problems.
I really want to follow up on something you said, Richard. Can we unpack the term civilization and talk about how it's used in the docuseries and how we want to use it here?
Yes, please. So I guess there was a moment in episode 2. So I was asking myself this question from the beginning, and watched all 3 at once. But there's this point in episode 2 where it seems as if civilization applies to groupings of people that built pyramids or skyscrapers, right? And there's another moment in the film where it's talking about the Congo River Basin, and Kelly McEvers says, about as far from civilization as you can get, right? And I think that there's this, there's some subtle biases built into this documentary that make it hard for the kind of knowledge that Ken is talking about to make its way into the stories that are being told in the documentary and the conclusions that it reaches. So, civilization here is, it's valued, clearly. It's a term that's given value within the documentaries, but it also seems to exclude other kinds of people, right? People who don't live, who didn't construct pyramids, or who don't live in skyscrapers. And I think there's as much to be learned from those groupings of people as there is from those who built pyramids and skyscrapers, or who worked metal or whatever it is. I don't know if Ken, if you had a similar response to the way in which that term was being used in the documentary.
No, I really don't. Civilization is determined by the conquering foe. and so right. Because we didn't have muskets and we didn't have metal, we became the conquered, and therefore we weren't able to define what we think civilization is. Civilization is everything. It's the birds, right. It's the flowers, it's the trees, it's the environment, it's all of us. And so we don't exclude, it's not just people. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And just one last note on that. So I think at the beginning of each episode in the docuseries, 2 things are said. One is, this is a podcast style documentary. And if somebody could explain to me what that means, or how it's different from a documentary, I'd love to hear it. But the other thing that's said is, we traveled the world with filmmakers and scientists to tell the story of water. And I think those are 2 very, very important groups for telling the story. And the work that the documentary does is really laudable. It's really important. But why, from the get-go, wasn't it, this is we followed filmmakers and scientists and activists and storytellers and keepers of tradition and so on, right, to tell this story of water in the world. And I think that that's the conception of civilization has something to do with this, with who is chosen to tell this story about water in the world today, from which I learned a whole lot. I don't say that to dismiss the qualities of the documentary, but there's some missed opportunities there.
I completely agree. I would love to see the episode of this docuseries on civilizations with the more inclusive definition that we've laid out here. Okay, I'm going to go on to another anonymous attendee question. Modern technology has allowed us to modify ecosystems on a more massive scale than ever before. Despite our advanced technology, it seems we still face many of the same issues that historical societies dealt with, and a host of new issues of our own making. What can we learn from how historical societies dealt with issues like a rapidly changing climate, population growth, and geopolitical constraints when we're working to manage fresh water? How has technology changed the equation and the options that are available to us for freshwater management?
I think that one's for Richard.
It's a big question.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, so I think the story that the documentary tells and often leans on is the possibility for a kind of technological solution to the water crisis, although it doesn't say that that's the exclusive source. But the moments that I like best in the documentary are those where, as I said earlier, there's this connection between a sort of long and deep dive into cultural history and the connection to the present. So the segment on China I found fascinating. And I teach a film, a feature film, a fiction film about life during the construction of the Three Gorges Dam. And the background material that the documentary provided is something I'm going to use henceforth when I teach this film, because it helps us connect a kind of anxiety, a present day cultural anxiety regarding flood, right, to a story that's been in circulation for 4,000 years. And I think that's the work that we all have to be doing. There's I think it's Sunjin who asked at the end of episode 2, and I find him a really compelling character. I mean, I think one of the most compelling interviewees in the series. He says at a certain point toward the end, we're raising these issues regarding the water crisis, and no one is listening, right? Well, I think you need to ask the question, why, right? Like, why is no one listening? I think it has something to do with this disconnect between people's cultural investments, cultural histories, and this kind of techno-scientific approach to the problem. And I'm going to start sounding like a broken record, but that's really, that's my plea to people working in the water space. And Athena just mentioned an organization that's doing this kind of work, getting us to think about cultural representation, art, storytelling, cultural history, oral history, in relation to the most up-to-date technological understanding of our water situation. Because otherwise, people won't listen. I think it's just not reasonable to expect that just looking at a kind of heat map is going to be sufficient to get people to change their behavior in relation to water.
So personal investment in water resources. What do you think, Ken?
What is it? Regurgitate tech approach. Oh yeah. In one of the last episodes of the H2O film, and there was this one of the scientists from Holland who was studying water usage, and he discovered that 1% of the water used in plants is actually used. The rest of it just sort of evaporates. And by capturing that in a greenhouse and recycling it, he's reusing the water. And so that's a wonderful thing. You don't have to drain the aquifers. You don't, my friends from India used to describe jumping in the aquifers and swimming around as little kids. And now they're way down. The Oglala aquifer is in trouble. California, I knew about California 20 years ago. The ground was shrinking. And so we're taking all this water from the ground and we're pumping it up into the air. And so how do we do that in an efficient way? Out here in the Northwest, we're very fortunate. We just walk around, dig a hole in the dirt and it fills up with water. You let it sit for a little while and you can drink from it. Tell the little kids don't splash around in your drinking water, but hey. So as Native people, we had these sites, and I can virtually guarantee you that there's not going to be a major Native site that's not located on a freshwater source. And the fresh water out here just pours out of the hills. Anybody that's been around to any of the major parks, even some of the developments around here, you're doing everything you can to mitigate the fresh water that pours out of the hills. So we've always had fresh water to drink. And so now we use water, as Native people, we use it for our highways, we use it for our food sources, we use it for all kinds of things. But it's the aquifers that really have me concerned.
In listening to Ken's response, I just had, there's one last thing that occurred to me in relation to the last part of the question, which was how has technology changed the equation and options available to us for freshwater management? So that we have to look backwards in a way for how we interacted with the environment and how we understood freshwater resources and how to preserve them. But I don't want to give the impression that I'm a kind of technophobe, and I don't think that there are possible compelling technological solutions, which all come at a cost, right? And that's maybe something we can talk about. But the tour that I take with students at the Brightwater Sewage Treatment Plant in Woodinville, and I recommend that to anyone who's in the area, it's absolutely fascinating. But there are two things there that I find really compelling. One, they could very easily be taking this water that essentially gets dumped into Puget Sound. Some of it is reused on golf courses, but with a very small input, the water coming out of the sewage treatment plant could be made potable, right? And there's a lot of talk about water recycling. This is, when you talk about technological solutions that don't have a huge cost, this is one of them. I mean, certainly the ecological cost is much smaller than desalination, whose embodied carbon is just horrifying, right? But the water's already being cleaned to re-inject it into Puget Sound. It's just one small step further to make that water drinkable. So maybe, there's a possible technological solution. What's interesting at Brightwater, though, is that, yes, you learn about that on the tour, but then you also realize that part of what they're trying to do on the Brightwater Sewage Treatment Plant tour is to get you excited about your infrastructure, to get you connected to it. So you begin to have a personal investment, not just in water in a kind of abstract sense, but in the systems that allow you to have access to water, and for the waste that you produce that's carried by water to not do massive environmental harm. And I think that's important, right? Like that's a useful application of technological know-how to a very, very serious problem.
Okay, I want to pose a question from Megan Diana Yanez. Her question is, what do you think the younger generation can do to help? Maybe that's spreading awareness, buying groceries locally. What would you recommend?
Who? Who's this for?
Question for both of you.
I would say become aware of where you are, become aware of the historical background, as I described, as the indigenous people. We didn't have any of these technological advantages. We simply had the environment. And so we lived the best we could based on the environment in which we lived. Today, we have all of these wonderful things happening, and King County and the city of Seattle both are on, it's either 50-year or 30-year plans to clean up wastewater. This is the runoff water, the very water that Richard was talking about. And a byproduct of that is a cleaner Puget Sound. And a byproduct of that is more Chinook salmon for killer whales. And the life begins to return. And so from a cultural perspective, from a native perspective, clean water going into the sound is a whole lot better than all the stuff that runs off of the roads and the freeways. So what can young people do? They can be aware of this stuff. They can be aware that the microfibers from car tires are damaging the Puget Sound in a tremendous way. We're realizing that now. And so when you come to that fork in the road, it's up to you to choose which way you want to go. And I would just want them to choose by way of education, either through public schooling or universities or self-taught. Just become aware of who you are in the world and what you can do to save it.
Yes, absolutely. And the first thing you can do is ask the question that you're asking, right? And that's the most important first step. I mean, beyond that, what you describe are sort of, these sort of personal choices that we make in the world as consumers, as neighbors, as friends, as inhabitants or guests in a region. But I think, a level up from that is thinking about water issues more broadly. And I noticed in the chat, there's a question just after this one regarding the kind of scale of thinking regarding the water crisis. So is it sufficient with the sort of issues of virtual water to just be thinking about one's watershed? No, right? And I think that the scientists among you recognize, of course, that you have to study locally, but think about how the phenomenon you're observing is, according to different inputs, going to work differently in another space. On my side of things, sort of arts, humanities, one of the questions that we try to look at is how do narratives participate in the creation of just societies, right? And so maybe what young people need to do, and what I see many of them doing, and it's really quite heartening, is to stand up in instances where there's significant, in this case, water injustice, right? So the outpouring of support for the Lakota people around the Standing Rock Reservation protests around the pipeline, I thought that was a really important moment. I'm almost inclined to say a watershed moment. There are complications, right? Like you have to know how to be a good ally. You have to ask before you intervene. But I think that this is where the situation, where I'm more hopeful than some of the folks who are interviewed in the documentary, because I see evidence of this kind of upwelling of commitment to broader water issues, especially around questions of water justice.
Excellent. Well, while we're on this topic, I'd like to address one of Gordon Holtgreaves' questions. Gordon is the director of the Future Rivers program. And Ken has spoken to this a little bit, but I wonder if both Ken and Richard have additional thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts and your perspectives on the role of freshwater in supporting local indigenous communities, past and present. Maybe Ken, you can tackle this one first.
I can only try. The word reservation comes to mind. Native people were moved off of their lands, at the beginning of the United States colonialization. Native people always, lived on the best of lands, where there was the best of water, the best of resources. And so when these stronger people came, they said, oh, we really like this land. And so they moved the native people off into these, these barren places where we had to learn how to survive, up to and including there's, no water. The Navajo today are in real trouble. They're living way out in the back, and there's no water, there's no electricity. And so they continue to struggle. So from our perspective, we no longer have access to those resources that we used to. And as hunter-gatherers, we require a lot of acreage just to survive on a day-to-day basis. So this whole farming concept was foreign to us. And so reservations come to mind as a place where people were pushed to, where resources were scarce, both in, you're not going to have many animals there because there's nothing to eat or drink. And water, you've got to have water, a gallon a day if you, get a lot. So H2O, when we talk about it, it's interesting to me. And I'm going to tangent off a little bit here, because I watch our space, I watch NASA, I watch people trying to go to Mars, and I say, find one blade of grass, just one. You're spending trillions of dollars to look for one blade of grass, and that grass is going to need some water. So, our scientists are out there looking for water planets, and that's a good thing. And so it just rings in our science fiction movies. It rings true for where we are right here. And right out here in the Northwest, we're just simply blessed.
Yeah, I'm tempted here to reply to the follow-up question that Athena asked in the chat regarding opportunities for developing freshwater sustainability in a more equitable and just manner. I'm tempted to put on my Canadian Studies Center hat and talk about emerging systems of governance in Canada, which has very similar longstanding historical problems in relation to its Indigenous communities and First Nations. But this emerging governance called nested federalism, where you have important high-level policy decision-making, not just consultation, but decision-making being made between provincial governments and First Nations that are within those provinces. And the system is very fluid right now. I mean, to call it a system is maybe an overstatement, but there's beginning to be an acknowledgement that, especially around issues of land development, land claims, water claims, and so on, that it's the height of folly to do this without significant representation of Indigenous peoples and First Nations. And as I say, Canada is not in a position to give lessons to the rest of the world, but I would say watch that space because there is promise there. And of course, as soon as disenfranchised voices begin to have very significant voices in these debates, the pushback can happen. But I think that, so how do you get there? I mean, that's really the nature of Athena's question. I think it's by doing as much as we can to foreground those voices in water politics that have been marginalized for centuries, right? And here too, again, maybe a small missed opportunity in the documentary. I watched all 3 episodes. The word colonialism never was uttered. Right? I mean, nor capitalism, nor privatization. And I realize it's not that kind of documentary, but it's really, I think that not talking about colonialism and Indigenous communities in particular, that was a missed opportunity.
Well, Richard, I'm sitting out here on the middle fork of the Snoqualmie River, and I'm afraid to move because as the world changes, my river, or this river, will be here for at least a little while, and I can just walk across the street with a bucket and say, here's fresh water, and I can use it for all manner of things. Well, it's fresher than the other way. And so, yeah, it's my whole family's done the same thing. For whatever reason, we all managed to end up on creeks or rivers or water. So as Indigenous people, it's an attraction for my family.
Ken, do you have some thoughts on Athena's question? I'm curious to know what you think our next steps are for advancing water justice for Indigenous communities.
No, I really don't. I don't have any thought on that. It's water is. It was expressed in your movie. Water is the new gold, and that's pretty much what I just said. It's not something you can spend, but it's something you can't live without. And so here I sit before you with all this technology, and I have the simplest of tools, a bucket. And that's all I need. So I don't have an answer for water injustice on Indigenous communities. There's too much injustice. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. We have another question from Hannah Besso. She asks, of course, we have to work with the tools we have to solve the current problems at hand. But I can't help but wonder on a larger scale how the harnessing of evaporation will impact the larger scale climate processes, like not returning that water to the water cycle. Does that seem like a valid concern, or would that likely be too small of a change in the water cycle to make a difference?
I'm inclined to answer that question. So, I'm a doctor, but the wrong kind, right? I'm a humanities scholar, but the documentary itself points to these technological advancements that each on its own doesn't produce a massive ecological ripple effect, right? But when you add up all the dams in the Northern Hemisphere, right, that retain water, and that, there's sort of local effects of that retention of water, something called reservoir-induced seismicity, right? So increase in earthquakes. Behind the Three Gorges Dam, it's absolutely stunning what's happening. But also, the tilt of the Earth's axis has changed as a result of the gathering of the water behind these dams. So it's not an unreasonable question that Hannah asks. Can, on a small scale, no is the answer, right? But who knows? Who knows? And this is, when folks talk about addressing climate change and addressing global warming by spraying reflective particles into the atmosphere, this should make us very concerned. This should make us very nervous, because what we don't realize are the unintended consequences of that kind of technological fix. You fix one problem, perhaps you create another. And so, the caution that Hannah's question implies, I think, is critical. And the, how do we get away from, pardon me, this is like a humanist speaking, but scientific hubris? Well, one of the ways we do that is we connect those who are imagining the technologies, developing them, with those who will be impacted by those technologies. This film I mentioned about the construction of the Three Gorges Dam, a film called Still Life by Jia Zhangke, is a film about the lives of the people behind the dam as the water level rises, who are displaced by this, right? That conversation, if you will, needs to happen before the dam is built, right? And the sort of impacts on watersheds, on people's lives, on cultural traditions, all that needs to be thought about before the dam goes up. And we have these rare successes where that kind of conversation happens after the fact, and then you have the removal of, let's say, the Elwha Dam and the Glines Canyon Dam. And I think most people see that as a sort of ecological success. So I think it's a great question.
Okay, I have just one last question for our panelists. And that is, this docuseries strongly implied that if we continue on our current trajectory, we are continuing on toward the end of human civilization, society, the way that we live on planet Earth as we know it today, that is coming to an end. Can human ingenuity help us avoid that fate? Are there technological innovations or new approaches that we can use to design a sustainable water future?
I hope so.
Same here, but I think the uncomfortable silence there for a moment tells you something. Like, the shift needs to be dramatic. Human ingenuity, that's a term that comes up a lot in the documentary. I believe in human ingenuity, but if we aren't thinking first about how we share equitably what we have, all the ingenuity in the world isn't going to solve the problem. And I think this is what I see the great educators in King County wastewater services. I see them doing this very work. They want people to think about their water and the sort of direct and intimate connection to that. Now, as Gordon Holtgreaves' question implied, there are global phenomena that kind of escape, right, this local care for your watershed. But it's, you know, first we have to be thinking about how we relate to water locally, the kind of assumptions that we make every time we open the tap. You know, that's something that needs to change. And you know, why is it that we use potable water whose treatment has a lot of embodied energy in it to, you know, water our gardens, right? I mean, there's so many assumptions built into how we use water that have sent us down a path of profound unsustainability. I mean, even in a place as gifted hydrologically as Seattle is, forget about Phoenix or Las Vegas or Jeddah, you know. So, you know, I guess in the end, I put less faith in human ingenuity, even though I put some faith in it. Then I put faith in, you know, ultimately our collective will to think through solutions that implicate everybody. And that's where we have to go. It's not looking for, you know, Elon Musk or a similar figure, right, to come up with like the one thing that's going to make it all okay. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, and then to tack onto the end of what Richard was saying, I'm a firm believer in small steps. The smaller the step, the better. Something that I can do, a 0 and a 1. I can do that simple thing, and I can do it repeatedly. But when you start getting into the bigger projects, pretty soon you end up with this, it's too big to do, or it's too complicated. And there are people that like those projects, but there are so many also that do the small stuff. Think of an ant farm. You know, you got all these little ants. They're all moving a little piece at a time. Pretty soon you got a big anthill. Bill Gates, he did the same thing with Microsoft. He started out just a little computer on a laptop, IBM. So small steps, that's what I would encourage people to take. Take the small ones.
I grew up in California during the droughts of the 1970s, and you know, one of the small steps that was being advocated was, if it's yellow, stay mellow, right? I mean, just, you don't have to flush your toilet every time. A brick in every pot, so displace water in the toilet tank with bricks or whatever, you know, whatever you can find. And it's true that, you know, that doesn't solve the global water crisis. It doesn't solve large scale water shortages or droughts, changes in the weather, but it does sensitize the individual, right, to the crisis and to small steps and to playing a role, right? And I think once you take those small steps, it becomes much easier to think about the magnitude of the problem, because you realize, well, I changed my behavior in relation to water. I installed a composting toilet, you know, like maybe others can do that. And then if it sort of happens on a very large scale, perhaps we can get back to something like a more sustainable relation to our water.
I think that's a lovely sentiment to end on. I want to thank our panelists for joining us, and I'll pass it back to Athena.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Great. Thank you. And yes, thank you, Chelsea, and thank you, Ken, and thank you, Rich, so much for the discussion. Thank you to all of our audience participation and questions that came in. That was a really fantastic discussion that we had. And building on that, I just wanted to remind folks that there is one more part to the spring speaker series. The third part, which is on the episode titled Crisis, will be Thursday, May 20th, same time, 11 to 1 Pacific time. And the theme we're going to focus on there is global politics and global health, and how that ties in with the water infrastructure. I think it just really builds out on some of what was brought up in this film. For instance, why is Saudi Arabia growing alfalfa in Phoenix, and really just expands on some of the subjects there. So we welcome folks to join that. Future Rivers will also be, for those of you who know, we launched feature film screening last this month, I can't keep track of the months anymore, during Earth Week. And we'll be doing another film screening in May called River's End, which also ties in with a lot of the themes brought up today, and is largely centered around groundwater and the agricultural infrastructure, specifically in California, but with lessons, again, that can be applied globally. So we invite folks to that as well. And I think with that, just a reminder, we'll get a message out with some of the resources that were mentioned on this call. There's links in the chat, both to the Brightwater Treatment Plant tour, as well as some eco tours that are run by the Duwamish Tribe, focused around the Duwamish River, which ends right here in Seattle, near West Seattle. And yeah, thank you, everyone. This was fantastic, and we hope to see everyone again soon. And that's it.